Alright, here's a very familiar diagram. We have this vector u, this vector v, and we're interested what is this vector w in terms of the other two. Now by now I think you're familiar enough with it just to write that that's equal to the v subtract the u, where that's where we're finishing, so that's why the v comes first and then the u. If we want to think where that comes from, we can actually think of it as starting at B, I want to finish at C. How am I going to do that? I'm going to go that way, and that way, and that way is negative U, that way is positive V. So clearly I've got to go backwards on the U vector plus the V, and that gives me this result. Now, a little more subtle. If M is the midpoint, I'll just mark that, is the midpoint, and we have the U vector and the V vector, what is the vector from A to M? Okay, what is A, M? Well, we can go here and then halfway along this vector, halfway. Now we worked out what BC is, therefore AM is equal to the U vector, so we're starting from A, going up the U vector, and half of this vector, which is half of V subtract U, which is U plus half of V subtract half of U, which is half of U plus V. And that's a very interesting result. Be careful, that's AM, which is this vector here. So this vector is half U plus V, whereas this vector in red, this vector is V subtract U, and if I want the half bit, it's half of that. Quite subtle. Alright. Another way of thinking why that's the case is to realize that we have a parallelogram here, and this halfway point, sorry, that's confusing. This vector here is just half the diagonal. And what's half the diagonal? Half the diagonal. Here's the diagonal. Half the diagonal. The diagonal is the sum. Okay. One final way of thinking about this that might be helpful. Imagine some coordinates for B and some coordinates for C. So if we put this in a vector form, in a component form, that would be his components and the C components. Ask yourself, what would that midpoint be? That midpoint would clearly be the average of the X components and the average of the Y components. So clearly it is half U plus V. Final thing worth considering. Observe that it doesn't matter where our starting vector is, our starting position. So we could move it to the side and have our vectors here, but the midpoint is still the sum of those. So OM is still OB plus OC, half of it.